I am so looking forward to speaking with Angus Lockhart, who is Senior Policy Analyst at the Dais. Angus, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me here.
Okay, so before we get started and talking about online harms in Canada, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about what you do at the Dais, just to give this conversation some context.
Yeah, so the Dais is a think tank that's part of Toronto Metropolitan University. Our research is really at the intersection of technology, democracy, and the economy. So anywhere any of those intersect, that's where we do most of our work.
Now, you have done a number of surveys that focus on online harms in Canada. The most recent is from 2024. So, before we get into some of the findings, what is the goal of this survey?
The survey started in 2019 as we saw a rising presence of harm online, anything from hate speech to misinformation, disinformation, harassment, identity theft. Sort of everything was growing throughout the 2010s, and in 2019 we decided to start tracking it in the Canadian context. And so more or less every year since then, we've been doing a survey of Canadians asking questions in three broad areas. So where are they spending their time online? What does the media ecosystem online look like? What are they seeing online? How prevalent are the different harms? And then how they think the internet should be regulated. So what they think government's role in this is and how best government can sort of try to improve the state of play.
As someone who has been reporting on online harms over the years and written a book on this topic, I think it's fair to say that we have really lacked Canadian data over the years. So it's great to see this focus specifically on Canadians. When you look at the survey from last year, what do you think are some of the most notable findings?
I think there was a pretty clear and simple story last year. So what we found is that online harms are extremely prevalent in Canada. When we look at any of the harms we measured, so anything from misinformation to hate speech to harassment, about two-thirds of Canadians see that online somewhere. About a quarter see it online every week for any one of those categories. And then when you ask about people's experience, about 10% of Canadians say they've actually been targeted by hate speech, targeted by harassment online. So we've seen that consistently, all of these have been extremely prevalent in Canada. And when I say consistent, I mean going back to 2019, all of the harms have stayed just about as present or they've gone up. Things like deepfakes have only become more common online. So the state of play right now, the state of affairs is not good, and Canadians are experiencing quite a lot of harm online. And they don't trust the platforms to solve it, which I think makes sense given that these have been around for quite a while and nothing has really been done. We haven't seen any improvements. So Canadians aren't expecting places like Facebook or Instagram to get any better on their own. Instead, they want the government to do something about it. They want the government to act. Support for some policies that the government could implement are as high as 90%. So there's strong consensus in Canada for action on this.
Let's dive into that detail in terms of some of the places where we're seeing the most online harm. You mentioned Meta, of course, the owners of Facebook and Instagram. And I think that was one thing that was notable to me on these platforms is that there is often a conversation that those platforms are places for older Canadians. But I think what we saw reflected in this, and when you talk specifically about people between the ages of 16 and 29, one of the top platforms for them continues to be Instagram. So can you speak a little bit about those places where Canadians are spending the most amount of their time?
Yeah, so like you said, Meta-owned platforms really dominate people's internet use habits. Facebook is still the most used platform, sort of on a daily basis. Facebook Messenger, which is slight offshoot, also extremely common. Both those platforms are obviously most common among older demographics, but young people still sort of a majority of the youngest cohort are using platforms like Facebook and Facebook Messenger. Instagram is also incredibly common. And WhatsApp, another Facebook owned platform, is only getting more and more common in terms of daily usage. And then some other platforms like YouTube round out the most common places people are spending their time online.
I'm not asking you to speak on behalf of government because I realize that's not your role. But one of the questions I have that runs through my head on a daily basis is why do we allow these US companies to come into the country, operate here without any guardrails, and in many instances, tear our communities apart?
So far, that's mostly just been a case of the government hasn't been able to get anything fully passed. So obviously, the Liberal government over the last year has really struggled to make any headway in Parliament. And they had a bill in place that would have helped this, the Online Harms Act. And there was a lot of hope that that would come into effect after many years of sort of drafting and discussing. But unfortunately, everything stalled, and that was on the agenda and it got stalled out. And so we're sort of going back to square one. Hopefully, long term, Canada is able to implement some form of legislation. There's a strong demand for it. People don't want these companies to be allowed to run amok and sort of regulate themselves however they want. But to now, that's mostly just how it's been.
I do want to talk about some possible solutions in the months and years to come, but I also want to dive into some of the findings insofar as misinformation and disinformation, because I think we're seeing that right now as we are in the middle of a federal election. We know that Canadians are not getting actual news because it's blocked within those meta platforms. And yet we also know that those are the places that they're going for their news. And then if we can add a layer on top of that, there is misinformation and disinformation, and in some cases, deep fakes that are spreading across those platforms. And even within the ad networks, those are advertisements that are paid for by organizations. So what would you say to this in terms of this perfect storm that we have right now in the digital space in the midst of an election like we have today?
Yeah, obviously, the fact that Facebook has limited access to news on, or that Meta's limited access to news on Facebook and Instagram is a problem. What other researchers have found is that a lot of sort of major news publications in Canada have seen their traffic from these platforms decline 90% plus. So it's been pretty devastating to people on Facebook's ability to get news from publications like the CBC and the Globe and Mail. But what we've found in our work is that there's been no decline in people who say they get their news from Facebook. So even though major news publications are no longer allowed on those networks, people are still finding some kind of news there. And it's just different news, right? So it's just news from either secondhand sources who are discussing it and maybe putting their own spin on it, or it's news from less reputable news sources, or it's just outright fabrications, deepfakes, things that aren't real. So there's obviously a perfect storm coming sort of from both sides, where lots of people are relying on Facebook and Instagram for news, and they're increasingly bad sources of it.
As you mentioned, you're in the fifth iteration of this report. And I imagine over the years, some things have changed, but generally speaking, like you mentioned, in some cases, things have gotten worse. What do you think the fallout is from this in terms of how it affects Canadians?
Yeah, so if it becomes harder to find news and reputable news, we'll see a huge increase in mis and disinformation and a huge decrease in trust. So one of the biggest issues that we have that we found in this survey is that the people who believe the most mis and disinformation are the least trustful of sort of general news sources, of places like government, of places like the media, to give them information. And so the more you believe mis and disinformation, the harder it's going to be to actually pull you back or to give you the news as it actually is.
Let's talk about another platform that is mentioned within this survey, and that is TikTok. Now, there has been so much attention directed at TikTok over the past few months. A lot of people, even in this survey, saying that TikTok should be banned in Canada. But when you look at the actual harms and the places where we're seeing the most hate and the most misinformation and disinformation, how does TikTok actually fare based on the data?
Yeah, there's two ways of looking at it. So the first way is that if you compare TikTok to other social platforms, it really doesn't look too bad. In terms of belief in mis and disinformation, TikTok is sort of middle of the pack for social media platforms. So people who are on TikTok are no more likely to believe mis and disinformation than people who are on Facebook or people who are on Twitter. But I don't think that that's the best benchmark. When you look at everyone, and so people who aren't on these platforms, TikTok is associated with higher than average belief in misinformation. It's just that all social media platforms tend to be associated with higher belief in misinformation. So there's nothing particular about TikTok that's associated with, extra disinformation, but use of any of these social platforms, especially as news sources, tends to lead you down a path of believing some form of misinformation.
Now, there was a time here in Canada, and I remember this because I've been an avid user of social media for, I'd say, 2 decades now. And there was a point where if you were harassed or bullied on Twitter at the time, or you had someone impersonating you within the meta platforms on Facebook or Instagram, there was recourse. There were people you could go to, there were teams that were there to protect users. But we're starting to see this absolute decline in terms of accountability on behalf of these social media networks, including just this year with Meta announcing that they were getting rid of fact checkers. What do you think this is going to do to this next round of surveys that you're going to have in the coming years as far as the results?
Yeah, the platforms used to have um, much more, they used to put a lot more effort into moderating themselves and ensuring the content on themselves was better. It never really pulled through in the numbers. It was always true that social media platforms were sort of bad news sources and hotspots of hate speech. But in recent months, largely since the shift in tone has happened down in the States, the shift up here has been sort of equal. And so these platforms are less well regulated, less well moderated than they used to be. It's possible that with the platforms pulling back and the government having done nothing to sort of step in that place and require any form of moderation, that the platforms will see an increase in things like hate speech and targeted harassment. Um, Sort of remains to be seen. And hopefully the government does step in, and so we won't have to worry about it.
What do you think the delay is? This is not a new problem. Like you mentioned, there were some steps made last year, but we certainly haven't made any progress. Is it that the big tech companies are too powerful? Is it that the government just doesn't have their act together on that front? We know Canadians want this in terms of regulation. So, what exactly is happening that's taking us so much time to lead in this area?
Yeah, I think there's two problems. The first is that government hasn't made it a priority. So, despite the fact that it's widespread and sort of ever omnipresent in Canada, government hasn't actually put this at the top of their priority list. And so it means that legislation takes longer to pass and they put other things ahead of it. And so you just need to wait for time in the docket to appear. And that time ran out. And so here we are, sort of back at square one. The other issue is the vocal minority who support free speech above all. So, in most cases, what protections against online harms mean is some form of content moderation on platforms. And every time you're doing that, you're going to offend the people who are free speech advocates and absolute free speech advocates. So there's a large vocal minority in Canada who will, in any of these situations, come out and oppose any sort of efforts to require platforms to take down content of any kind on the grounds that they have a right to free speech. Our survey has found that that is a minority of Canadians, that consistently at least 2/3 of Canadians support regulation of platforms and sort of protection of people in Canada over an absolute right to free speech. But that vocal minority does make it a lot harder for government to act quickly.
So I want to go back to something you said at the beginning of that statement. You said that government hasn't really made it a priority. Why do you think that is? Because the data has been pointing in the same direction for many, many years. And I'm sorry if I seem frustrated. In 2016, I wrote a book on this topic. That's a long time ago. We've known that this is a growing issue. So is it that in government we just don't have people who maybe understand the extent of the problem, or is it just sort of malaise in terms of being slow to adapt?
I think it falls more so in that second category. I'm sort of an optimist that these people do understand the problem. And from what I've seen, lots of people within government do. Um, it's just a very hard thing to keep up with, a hard thing to decide how to appropriately regulate it, and a hard thing to try to find consensus on because there are so many people who have so many different beliefs. And you do run sort of the risk of limiting people's free speech in a way that isn't necessary. And so I think it is a challenging issue, but it is something that if we can move it up the agenda of the next government, whoever that might be, hopefully we can see some action on.
What would that action look like in a perfect scenario? If some changes were made, what can we learn from other countries who've made more progress on this front? What do we know based on your research that could be done while protecting free speech, but also protecting online users, especially the next generation?
Yeah, the place where you have a lot of consensus on what should be done is protecting children. Generally, across the board, most people think that children are underprotected online and that they think that there is clear room to do things to protect children. The thing that we tested that's most popular in Canada is requiring platforms to quickly remove any child sexual abuse material and report it to the police, which is sort of astonishing that platforms aren't already required to do that. But anything related to protecting children online tends to be more popular. The other area is protecting people from non-consensual intimate images. So in general, that should be more heavily regulated. But in particular, with the rise of deepfakes and the rise of deepfaked non-consensual intimate images, there's a huge need for platforms to be required to take this down and limit the spread of this content.
And when we look to the future, I think it is reassuring. Certainly, I've heard at least one of the leaders speak about this very issue, which was refreshing during a federal election, knowing that, again, this is more of a priority. But when we look at the future of potentially having solutions on this front, we would inevitably need Meta to be able to cooperate, as just one example, as well as other social media platforms. What are the chances that they will, based on the fact that they certainly didn't cave at all in terms of the request to support local news and journalism? How likely is it that they will be supportive of some of these initiatives?
Yeah, it's a really tricky situation for Canada because we are a small market. And so, for instance, in the case of the news ban, Meta made the calculation, and they were probably right about it, that people wouldn't care enough about it and they could just ban news platforms on their website without affecting their own traffic and without having to pay out anyone. And so, Canada being a small market, I think the most obvious thing is that we won't be able to do this alone. If we want any kind of power to force platforms to do things, we should look to other models that have already been more effective and look to other jurisdictions that have larger populations that we can sort of line up with. And so the most obvious case is Europe, which has been miles ahead of Canada for a decade now in regulating the internet, and try to develop a regime that at least in part looks like the European regime, so that we have more bargaining power and so that the platforms are more likely to cooperate because they're already having to do it over in Europe.
We also have someone on this episode who is talking about the legal side of things in terms of deep fakes and what victims can do. So, really grateful that we're able to address that in this episode. When we look to the legal side of things and the recourse that individuals can take in terms of being victims of things like deep fakes, it also brings to question some of the advertisements that we're seeing across these social media platforms, because I'm not a lawyer, but I would expect that with some of these deep fakes that are masquerading as political ads that are misconstruing people's images and likeness, there are actually laws in Canada to prevent that from happening. So, what do you think about that situation? Sort of the laws that we currently have in place are just blatantly being broken pretty much on a daily basis.
Yeah, I think that that's obviously an issue. We do some work with an organization called Who Targets Me, which is an organization based out of the UK that does some really interesting work related to advertising, and especially advertising on Facebook during elections. And so they've done some work to try to find and spot parties using deepfakes in their advertisement. And what they found is that there's very little of that so far, thankfully. Insofar as it's happening, it's very much a fringe behavior. And so, at least when we're talking about the political parties, we seem to mostly be in a pre-deepfake era. We haven't seen parties use it in any kind of malicious way, through advertising. That said, a lot of advertisers are not well regulated. If you look at advertisements on X, the quality of advertisements on X have declined dramatically since a lot of large advertisers pulled out. And so it's really easy to imagine that people are using platforms like X to spread deepfaked content and misinformation throughout the election with very little oversight.
I know this is hard to answer, but if we don't get this right, if we fail to introduce any type of legislation around keeping people safer online, what do you think the long-term effects are on Canadians?
The biggest long-term effect that we at the Dais are concerned about is the general erosion of trust in institutions. It's something that I think we've seen pretty dramatically over the last decade or so, particularly in the United States, but also in Canada. People are much less trusting of government and of the media. And all of these online harms, but especially mis and disinformation and deepfakes, are only going to accelerate that decline in trust over time. And if you lose people on trust, you're not going to be able to pick them up anywhere else.
Now, just for my final question, because one of the things I try to do on the show is to ensure we have practical things that individuals can do to protect themselves online. And I realize that's not the area of focus of this particular survey. But what would you say to people who are listening to this, who are feeling overwhelmed, who are worried about some of the issues we've talked about today? What can they do until they have their governments looking after them to be able to stay safer in those online spaces?
Yeah, a couple sort of very generic pieces of advice would be one, liberally use the block button on these platforms. They are required to allow you to block people, and that is one of the most effective ways at limiting sort of the ability of other people to target you with hate speech and with any kind of harassment. So block people at any time for almost no reason to limit your exposure to that. And the second is something that's been said many times, but make sure to fact check everything you see online. Go directly to news publications, the places that you know you can trust information. So try to get your news from newspapers, try to get your news from news websites, from the radio, from television, and don't just rely on news coming across your TikTok feed or your Instagram feed, because that's the place that actual news is, and that's the place that you know you can trust what you're seeing.
Absolutely. For people who want to check out the survey and follow along with any future surveys, where's the best place for them to go?
Yeah, our website is dais.ca, dais.ca, and you can find all of our reports and our sign up for our newsletter there.
Excellent. Well, listen, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.